Hi everyone, welcome and thanks for coming. So hopefully we'll see a few more people trickle in here, but I'm going to get the evening started so that we can have enough time for questions. With Noel with our guest being on the East Coast. So my name is Taylor Jaworski, and I'm an economics professor here at the University of Colorado Boulder. And so tonight we're going to hear from Noel Johnson, and he's going to talk to us about, from George Mason University, and he's going to talk to us about his book, which I have here, Persecution and Toleration, The Long Road to Religious Freedom. So I think you'll see a couple more pictures of that tonight. But before we get started, I wanted to just mention, so tonight's event is sponsored by the Benson Center here at the University of Colorado. And the mission of the Benson Center is to explore the culture, languages, and enduring ideas of the Western tradition, while also increasing intellectual and political diversity at CU by fostering dialogue and civil debate on the central issues of our time. So before we get started, I want to also announce an event that's going to take place next Tuesday, March 16th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. The event's going to be moderated by the Benson Center Director, Dan Jacobson, and will feature Robert Riley, Director of the Westminster Center, talking about the challenge posed to American pluralism by non-pluralistic ideologies. So if you're interested, you can learn more about that event on the Benson Center website and sign up as you wish, and along with any other events that you might be interested in, and YouTube videos of past events. So during tonight's webinar, you can ask questions using the Q&A function that's down below here on your screen. And so you can do that at any time. And then once Noel is done sort of telling us about the key aspects that he wants to tell us about with respect to his book, I will kind of moderate a discussion based on questions from the audience, from you all. So before I turn things over to Noel, I want to give him a little bit of an introduction so that you know where he's coming from and who he is. And so we're going to hear from Noel Johnson, and he's an economic historian and economics professor at George Mason University. He received his PhD in economics from Washington University in St. Louis, and writes on a variety of topics, including the French Revolution, pandemics, so highly relevant, and maybe he'll get a few questions about that, at least from me tonight, and as well as other aspects of European economic history. He writes both in kind of leading economics journals, as well as sort of for the kind of more popular more popularly sort of in other venues. And so I encourage you to go on his website and check him out in those venues if this is something that interests you. So as I said earlier, Noel is going to talk to us about his book. So I'll show it one more time here. Persecution and Toleration, The Long Road to Religious Freedom. So this book is fascinating. I read it probably a year or two ago, and it has lots of details about economic history in Europe, and then in particular, the role that economic forces played in changing attitudes toward different religious groups, and ultimately sort of creating or helping to create a sort of genuine idea of religious freedom. I see Noel and then his co-author on the book, Mark Koyama's kind of task more broadly as providing an answer or the beginning of an answer to kind of a fundamental question, sort of, I think, for our time, which is how do we sustain small L liberal reform? So not the reforms proposed by a particular political party, but how do we sort of create reforms that can sort of start to include more diverse and different kinds of people in a society, where Noel, of course, in this talk is going to talk and focus on religion and religious groups. But I think there are going to be continuing lessons from Noel's from some of the insights that Noel has into sort of how any society or country seeks to reform itself and then sustain those reforms in a way that can perpetuate benefits to its citizens. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Noel to talk to us about the church, the state, and the origins of religious freedom.
Okay. Thank you very much, Taylor. I really appreciate the introduction. And I'd also like to thank everybody at the Benson Center for inviting me to give this talk. I'm excited to do it. So I'm just going to put some slides up and make them big. Right. And as Taylor graciously and helpfully noted, I'm going to be basing what I tell you tonight off of a book that I wrote with my co-author, Mark Koyama. You know, this is just me selling it. It's a great book. $22 at Amazon for the paperback, or you could treat yourself to the deluxe hardcover for about $90. But I'd like to start the talk tonight in a slightly different way than I often have before, by talking to you a little bit about the painting that is on the cover of the book. Because while Mark and I didn't realize the story behind the painting when we wrote the book, we actually discovered it's highly relevant for what we write about. So this painting is titled The Massacre of the Innocents, and it is by Peter Bruegel the Elder. He painted it, we think, in 1567, or he completed it in 1567. And it's a common theme for a painting, the Massacre of the Innocents. You can see these versions of paintings throughout history, representing the scene from the book of Matthew, where Herod orders the killing of all children under the age of 2 because he doesn't want Jesus to take power, right? So he's trying to kill the infant Jesus. And so these paintings are often, showing this act of savagery. Now, like Bruegel often does in his artwork, he situates the massacre in what was for him a contemporary scene, which was 16th century Flanders, the Low Countries, the Netherlands, which at the time was the Spanish Netherlands, because the Bourbon rulers of Spain basically also were in control of Flanders at that time. And the king at the time was named Philip II in Spain, and he ruled based on, basically he was a Catholic, and the Catholic Church gave him legitimacy to rule. But by 1567, this is after the time that the Reformation has kicked off, and that's 1517, when we usually date the Reformation to beginning, when Martin Luther posts his theses, presumably. And what was happening in the Low Countries is that people were starting to adhere, starting to join the non-Catholic religion, so Protestantism in various forms. They were dissenting. And this was a challenge to the power of Philip II. And so he started cracking down on this dissent. And this Massacre of the Innocents painting, you can see there are soldiers, both Spanish soldiers in the red of the Habsburg family, also Landsknechte, right? So basically loyal to the land, like soldiers. They're basically mercenaries. They are coming in, or not soldiers from the Holy Roman Empire, right? That are also present and pillaging this town. Now, that's just some of the background of the history that surrounds the painting. And here's the next. I'm going to come back to the painting in just a second. This is this picture of the Duke of Alba, who's also going to come up in just a second in the painting. Right around the time that this painting is done, Philip II had sent the Duke of Alba with 10,000 troops to basically suppress the Dutch revolt, and he did that with great vigor. So another a name for the Duke of Alba is also the Butcher of Flanders. He ends up killing thousands over the course of trying to suppress this revolt, which, by the way, ultimately fails after the start of the 80 Years' War. The Dutch eventually get their independence. But what's interesting about the painting is that if you zoom in on some of the details of it, you can see that this is an odd kind of massacre that's taking place. So the detail on the left, you can see that the soldier is carrying a goose by the neck, And for some reason, the villager is trying to drag his daughter towards the man with the soldier with the goose. On the right hand detail, you can see on the far right a woman clutching a pot to try to keep a soldier from taking it, and other women are crying and wailing over packages that look like packages of flour. In the center of the right hand detail, you can see the soldiers skewering turkeys and a boar and other birds in the background. So this is supposed to be representing the murdering of innocent children, the massacre of the innocents, but why does it look like this? In 1998, this mystery was solved when, while doing routine conservation work in London, so this is in the Royal collection in England, and they were doing routine conservation work on the original piece, right, that I showed you at first. And they took an infrared photo and they discovered that, in fact, the painting had been censored. Okay, these images were painted over. And so this is no longer from the original painting, because that's still, you have to look at infrared photos to see it, but there are copies that exist in other parts of the world that we can see what was intended originally, like what the original painting looked like. And so, for example, Bruegel's son also did a version of the painting. So on the left-hand panel, you can see that goose was actually a child being carried away by the soldier to be slaughtered. And tragically, the villager is trying to convince the soldier to take his daughter instead of the boy that he has in his hand. And the right-hand detail, you can see that now the pot is actually a baby that's being taken by from the woman. And those sacks of grain are dead babies that have been killed by the soldiers. And of course, the center of that detail, you can see the soldiers are skewering children. So the question then becomes, why was this painting censored? And so this is one reason why I think it's such an interesting piece of art, and will tie into the story I'm going to tell you for the next few minutes, is that there's both the story there's the story in the painting, right, which is interesting, but there's also the story of the painting, like why was it changed in the way it was? So the person who we know made the changes, or had ordered the changes made, is Rudolf II. So the painting was 1567 when it was completed. By 1577, we know that Rudolf II owns it. He is a Habsburg. Philip II is his maternal uncle. He is the Holy Roman Emperor. He is the King of Hungary, and he is also the King of Bohemia, which was a major state at this time. So in Bohemia, there are 4 different religious sects that exist. So there were Catholics, there were Lutherans, and then there were these 2 other that were more unique to Bohemia, related to Hussite rebellions that had happened earlier, the Ultraquist and the Unitas Fratrum. So there's a decent amount of heterogeneity within his kingdom about people who were not necessarily Catholic. There were people who had other religious beliefs. Now in 1575, Rudolph's father, who's Maximilian II, he had been presented by these religious leaders of these religious sects with something called the Bohemian Confession, which was guarantee religious rights to these sects. So Rudolph's father, so Maximilian II, he dies the next year without ratifying this document. And so when Rudolph II comes to power in 1576, and he has this painting in his collection, and it basically is portraying in graphic detail what his maternal uncle, Philip II, did when there was religious heterogeneity in the land he ruled. He basically tried to slaughter the opposition, slaughter the non-Catholics. But Rudolph made a choice, apparently, that, well, first of all, I should say, we don't know what the motivation was that Rudolph had, for painting, like having this painting altered. It's doubtful that he was squeamish or anything like that. He was a well-known patron of the arts who collected all sorts of different things, right, that were considered to be odd by people. There's even a story that, on the accounts of one of the castles, there was, I believe, a tiger that was allowed to run loose, right? And so they had to pay off victims the tiger got from time to time, right? So, and he was also a big major patron of science, or in nascent science, at that time. So I think the most likely reason he's doing it is because he doesn't want this inflammatory piece of artwork showing what his uncle did, right, in his kingdom to undermine his authority in Bohemia, okay, which is where a lot of this action is taking place. So he had it censored. And eventually Rudolf also is going to issue something called the Letter of Majesty in 1609, which is going to follow through on basically what the Bohemian Confession was attempting to do, which was to grant the authority, the ability, okay, of the different sects in Bohemia to worship, giving them an unprecedented amount of religious freedom. A freedom which, by the way, is ultimately going to fall apart by 1618, when some of you may have heard of the Defenestration of Prague. It was the throwing out of the window of some Catholic authorities in Prague when the Protestants who came with the Letter of Majesty did not think they were going to be able to get it renewed. And this set off the 30 Years' War, one of the most bloody wars that ever occurred in Europe up to that time. So further bolstering the story about what Rudolph's potential motivations are, we know he effaced from the painting Catholic or Habsburg imagery, right? And so if you remember the picture of the Duke of Alba, he had the beard, this guy in the left panel, that beard, in the original painting, he's there. In the painting on the right-hand side, that's gone. If you look at the banner that's being held on the left-hand one, which is the when I say original, I should say that's how the painting was originally drawn, right? On the left-hand panel, that's basically 5 crosses, which is the symbol of Jerusalem, which the Habsburgs claimed the right to rule. But if you look at the altered painting, the one that Rudolf had altered, that is now a lion on the banner. So it's been changed. So it seems like he was trying to distance himself from the Bourbons, right? The actions that were taking place in the Low Countries in order to try to maintain a religious peace in his kingdom. So let me now try to relate this in a broader way to some of the things that were happening in Europe around this time and what the ramifications of them were. So I apologize, there are going to be some words instead of pretty pictures now, but not too much, okay? So the Reformation, I would argue, was a critical juncture for European states. Some could go one way, others could go another way. And depending on which way they went, there were major implications for them. So before around the 16th century, when there were heretical movements in a polity, they were almost always crushed. So like the Cathars in the 13th century, the Lollards in the 15th century. So religious conformity was part of a deal between the church and the state, where the church gave legitimacy to the state, and then the state agreed to maintain the Catholic Church's monopoly. After the 16th century, due to a bunch of factors, but one of them being increases in the size of the state's fiscal and administrative capacity, this increasingly brought these states face to face with heretical subjects. And also the Reformation, unlike previous movements that deviated from Catholic belief, it actually found legs and adherents. The book is not about why, right? But we know that one reason was that the printing press played a big role. But the outcome of one of the things that the Reformation did was it created more religious heterogeneity in states, and also people started adhering to those sects with a greater vigor. That was called confessionalization. So they actually started taking the rules of their separate beliefs more seriously. How states responded to the Reformation mattered a lot. So some states, like Spain, succeeded in repressing religious diversity, and they remained reliant on religion for their political legitimacy. And other places, like England and the Dutch Republic, and to a lesser degree in France, they are going to succeed in moving away from religion as their source of legitimacy. And one of the things I'm going to argue is that those places that were more successful in abandoning the religious legitimation for rule, they were also more successful in building state capacity, and they also were more likely to abandon identity rules, and they experienced higher growth. So I have the word state capacity and identity rules in blue to remind me to define them for you a little bit, and then I'll be using them more and more through the talk. So state capacity, I think of as simply administrative and fiscal capacity. So can the ruler rule, or can the government impose a rule on the subjects? And fiscal capacity is, can the government extract revenue in order to do things with it? They don't have to be good things like welfare. It could be things like fighting war, but that's all state capacity means in my telling. Identity rules are going to play a major role here. Those are rules that say that an individual is a part of a group, and then the rules apply to groups, not individuals. So I'll give you more examples as we move forward, but one would be if you were a Jew in the 16th century in a city in the Holy Roman Empire somewhere, then you were certainly treated differently by law because of your affiliation with that religion than if you were a Catholic or a Protestant even at a certain point. There are going to be even more kinds of identity rules, like if you were part of a certain guild, you'd be treated differently. If you had a different kind of social class, if you were a knight, you'd be treated differently. If you were a member of the nobility, you'd be treated differently. But the key here is it's not our liberal notion of how we treat individuals by law, is that individuals are treated as part of a group, not as an individual. And that's going to have big implications for my story. This is just, I made the claim just for those 4 places that that the ones that were better at distancing themselves from religious legitimation for rule tended to have higher state capacity. That's what's measured on the y-axis, just in terms of how much could be extracted over the next couple hundred years. You can think of it as investments that were taking place in state capacity over time, and they were also richer. So the y-axis is just the average GDP per capita, over a very long period of time, but just think of it as trying to measure some average of their success. And we can see Spain did very poorly, France was in the middle, England and Netherlands did well. I wouldn't make too much of the exact numbers, but the basic ordering is of interest to me. So what I want to do with the remaining time that I have is attempt to unpack a little bit about what the story was, what the underlying institutions and history were for this transformation that was taking place. What is it that led us to the point that's being portrayed in the painting and also in the story of the painting, right? Where you had rulers that were attempting to maintain peace or deciding to double down on religious legitimation in their lands, and why their decisions had major implications. So I want to try to convince you of 3 things about medieval European institutions. Okay, and those 3 things, and I'm going to go through them in a little bit of detail, but I'll just say them first. The first is that religion was important for legitimizing many forms of social organization. Second, that identity rules were pervasive. And third, that there was low state capacity. So think of this as the beginning period, right? And then we're going to go through a transformation, and then there will be outcomes. So first, religious legitimacy mattered. So it mattered at a big aggregate macro level. This is probably not surprising to many of you. Here's an example. This is one of the best examples one can come up with. This is Charlemagne, the Carolingian ruler, being crowned by Pope Leo III in Rome, I believe on Christmas Day in Rome in 800. Okay, and this was basically at the time. Pope Leo III was having trouble maintaining his power, and this was basically a compact between the religious authority, the Catholic Pope, and one of the most powerful rulers of the day, Charlemagne. That Charlemagne would enforce Catholicism as the religion of the land, and the Pope in turn would have the Church support the political legitimacy of Charlemagne. by the pulpit, but also through other means that we can talk about a little bit more, like providing law services and education and things like this. We know that when the pact between the church and the state failed, there were often dire consequences. So this is a really, I like this picture. This is just basically political boundaries in Europe around 1600. And what is interesting here to me is that you can kind of see France, you can kind of see England, you can kind of see Spain, you can see 2 or 3 territories there, Italy, a little bit less so, but you can hardly see anything like Germany. Those are all just separate individual states. Sometimes each of the little ones are owned by multiple people, but it's just highly fragmented. One reason why it's so highly fragmented is because in the 11th century, there was something called the Investiture Controversy, which was a break between the ruler, Henry IV, and the Catholic Church, Pope Gregory VII. And this led to outright, basically, war between them. And as a consequence of losing the legitimation of the church, other potential rulers of that region started turning on Henry IV, right? And this eventually ended up in a fractionalization of the territories, which persisted for a very long time. So it could be bad, right? You know, when this religious legitimation failed. Religious legitimacy also mattered at a more micro level. So that's just a quote from about a guild and its regulations. So we know organizations like craft guilds combine material and religious rewards, and that basically that the religious sanctions depend on members of the guild having a common religious identity. So again, these are identity rules, but also religion is tied up in what those rules were. And now that bound to identity rules, that's the second thing I wanted to convince you of, that these were prevalent. And I think one of the best examples I can give to you of these are Jewish communities. So I like this engraving a lot. This basically is showing us Emperor Henry VII, another Holy Roman Emperor. In 1312, he is granting a charter of privilege to the Jewish community. So you can see, first of all, you can see in here the group identities that are being reinforced in the artwork. So the Jews are all dressed in the same way. They're portrayed in an anti-Semitic way with large nose. The hats, you know, are all the same. And also you notice that they're almost the lowest in the picture that they're going to be. You can see Emperor Henry VII. He's riding a horse, and you know he's the emperor because his horse is flying. His hooves don't touch the ground, and he's also highest up, right? You know, in the picture. And then behind, you can see, you know, some knights in the very back, bishops behind the emperor, and these groups, they all had different statuses, and this status extended to law. So something now to take into this, which is going to lead us into my final point about the claims I made, that there was low state capacity. One way that these identity rules were used is that a ruler would grant a privilege to some defined group, and that group, and then that group in return would often give taxes or at least not revolt from the ruler when he granted that privilege. This was a particularly pernicious and frequent thing that was done with Jewish communities, where you would have the authority, the government, grant the Jewish community a privilege like the right to lend money at interest, which for Christians, for Catholics at this time, you're not allowed to lend money at interest because that's a usury restriction that comes from very early in the history of the religion. And but Jews were not Catholics, and so they were exempt from this rule, but they still needed to get permission from the authorities to do it. And then so what would happen, Jews would have a monopoly right to lend money at interest. They would often make profits from doing this, from lending the money at interest. They are, after all, they have a certain degree of monopoly authority, monopoly power in that circumstance. But then, of course, the secular authority would tax away any profits that they could from the Jewish community. And this was relatively easy to do because the identity rules said that Jews had to live in certain areas, they had to dress a certain way, they were easy to identify, they only lived in the town by the grant of the secular authority, and also the particularly pernicious aspect of this political economy equilibrium is that while Jews were acting often as monopoly lenders of money, then this gave them a bad reputation among those they were lending to, reinforced negative stereotypes of Jews, and individuals didn't realize that, of course, they didn't get to keep these monies, but the anti-Semitism that was reinforced by the economic equilibrium made it easier for the secular authorities to expel or persecute the Jews in the circumstance in which they, if they didn't pay. Okay, so that leads us to the final thing. There was low state capacity in medieval Europe. So this doesn't go quite far back as we'd like, but you can just think of this diagram as being the same if you go before 1500 for all intents and purposes, as it is at 1500. So if you look, this is just taxes collected per capita in England, Spain, Prussia, France, and Austria, to the extent that we can define those polities at various points in time. And you can see that there's really not much increase in fiscal capacity of these states until after the 17th century, when it really starts to go up. And this is, I think, related to the reliance on religion and to legitimate, and also on the reliance on identity rules, because you did not have to invest in tax collectors or bureaucracy or anything like this if you had the church authorities giving you legitimacy and telling people to pay taxes, and you had the ability to use the identity rules to grant privileges, which you then received revenue in exchange for, like in the story of the Jews that I just told you. So I'm going to go through this relatively quick because nobody wants to look at my arrows too much, and I want to get to the rest of the story, and I have about 10 minutes to do it, I think. So this is just to summarize some of the things I just said to you, and also show you how they are all related together in what we can call an equilibrium, a political economy equilibrium. And then we can start talking about what undermined this and why it led to the results that I'm arguing we see. So first, identity rules and low state capacity reinforce each other. As I just discussed, as identity rules are basically a cheap way to govern. Okay, grant a group of privilege in exchange for revenue or protection. So another example of doing this I mentioned the Jewish example, but you could also, for example, give the church the right to run a town, like a bishop, a right to run a town. Then you don't have to worry about how that town is run. You granted that privilege, but again, you're getting in exchange from that, you're getting something from the bishop. But a key thing here is that you don't really have an incentive to invest in the institutions that would allow you to collect taxes if you have these identity rules to use. The second thing, identity rules and reliance on religious legitimacy were reinforcing each other because religion was the most salient identity at the time. And so that the prominence of the religion strengthened the legitimizing power of those religious authorities. And then last, low state capacity and reliance on religious legitimacy reinforced each other. So the state starting out of the position where it's lacking the capacity to regulate or provide welfare, and this was very often outsourced to religious authorities. So the Catholic Church was doing law, okay? It was codifying canon law. It was providing judges for a great deal of time. It was involved in education, particularly at the university level. It was involved with welfare, right? When there were hard times, the church would often become involved. It was involved with the municipal administration. I just mentioned the example where often you'd have a bishop who was running a town. And it was also involved with regulations concerning morals, okay? And so this is a lot of the tasks that we now think should be going to a state were being handled by religious authorities. And again, this is lowering the incentive that a state might face to building capacity. So these all interact together. And one side effect of them is that religious minorities are going to be in a precarious position and they'll be subject to violence. You can think of the very fact that you are treating people as members of some religious group, or that religion is defining where the groups come from, this now means that people who deviate from the dominant religion that's legitimizing all of these things are in a position where they could have their rights violated. It's also going to limit economic growth. Again, if you think about treating individuals as part of a group and assigning them rights as group rights instead of as an individual, this is going to make it hard for people to, for example, move, right? If you can be in a guild by virtue of the fact that you are part of this town, you have much lower incentive to move to another town, right? If you are a Jew in one of these communities, you cannot just go live wherever you want to. You cannot go to a school if you want to. I haven't even mentioned things like gender, but that also would tie into how these rules are interacting in society. And then the reason why this equilibrium is going to start to break down, Mark and I argue in the book, is that over time, as you have increases in state capacity due to a bunch of things like state competition and the military revolution, then states begin to realize that they have a lot of more heterogeneity under their governance than they did before. And this is going to make it harder for them to put people into these separate identity categories that they are traditionally relying on. And so that's going to put the system under pressure. And then this is going to come to a head, we argue, in particular at the time of the Reformation, because this is going to introduce even more categories that the state can no longer fit people into in the way that makes sense to them. And one of the responses to this is going to be either you attempt to eliminate the religious dissent, okay? You eliminate the deviance from the Catholic religion that you have, or even if eventually some states are going to rely on Protestantism to legitimate the rule, like Sweden, right? And to the extent that they rely just on a single religion to make the government legitimate, then this is going to make this equilibrium more stable. Now, if they want to do that, they either have to eliminate the dissent, right? And some places do this. I mentioned Spain before, and in other places like in Flanders, the Spanish Empire tries to kill the dissenters and bring them under the heel. But in other places, the government will start to move away from this equilibrium and abandon religion as a legitimizing principle. It'll become less important. And once that happens, it means that you now have to invest in things like state capacity, and you are also open to putting people into different sorts of categories. And often those categories are going to be ones that, to borrow the terms of James Scott, they're going to be attempting to make subjects more legible, more taxable, and often boils down to making them more interchangeable. So the religious identities will no longer become salient. And in fact, you start treating people more as individuals than as a group. So with the final few minutes that I have, I think I have about 8 or 9 minutes since we started 5 minutes after, I'm going to, maybe 5 minutes, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some of the consequences of this equilibrium, and also when this breaks down. So I mentioned that conditional toleration equilibrium, this thing right here, one thing is going to lead to minorities being in a precarious position and subject to violence. We can test this in various ways. One way is to go collect data on Jewish communities across Europe and look at where they were at different times and when they were persecuted at different times. And so this map, each circle represents where a Jewish community was at some time. Source down there's a question mark. It's from one of my papers. The bigger the circle, the more persecution took place. So we have these data, they go between 1100 and 1800. And so the bigger the circle, the more persecution, that is an expulsion or killing of a Jewish community, occurred, okay, during that time. The triangles mean that a Jewish community lived there and they were never persecuted, never expelled or killed during the time. Usually those triangles are closer to Eastern Europe, which is interesting for reasons that we don't have time to get into right now. Okay, and we can then ask, well, if there are bad economic times, does that result in more pressure to harm these communities? either for scapegoating because crops are failing, or maybe the ruler needs to extract more revenue from them. And the best way to do that is to expel them and take all of their stuff so that the ruler can pay off people who have the crops failing. So we can look at economic shocks because we have yearly data on average summer temperatures, so growing season temperatures across Europe that come from tree rings and pollen counts and things like that. And when we look at what the impact of really cold weather shocks was on persecution of Jewish communities, we do find that before 1600, in colder years, Jewish communities were more likely to be persecuted. That effect disappears after 1600. Having a drought, so a rainfall shock, has a very similar effect, although we can only measure that from slightly later period. And we know that those effects were weaker, they weakened in states that were more effective at abandoning religious legitimation. So if you look, for example, at the ratio of persecution after 1600 to the ratio or to the amount before, this is measured in city years, but you don't have to worry about that too much. In England, it's zero, right? There's no persecution after 1600. There was before. In France, it's 10%. In Italy, it's 61%. And in Austria, it's about 1.1. And in Spain and Portugal, of course, the number doesn't make sense because they expelled their Jewish communities completely at the end of the 15th century. So that's consistent with our story, I think. The last thing I will talk to you about, and then I'll shift over to some questions and hopefully some answers, is that I made the claim that abandoning the religious legitimation and engaging in greater tolerance for religiously deviant groups also came with economic benefits. And again, one of the better places or the easier places, and I would argue better places for us to look for evidence of the impact of toleration on economic growth would be to focus on Jewish communities again. And what this is a map that just shows us between 1400 and 1850, where Jews lived, those are open circles, and then where we observe city populations, those are the dark filled circles. And we can match, over time, which of those cities had a Jewish community and which didn't. And then we can ask the question, well, if you have a Jewish community in your city, do you grow faster? And the answer is yes. So you don't have to think too much about what's on the y-axis there. It's a growth rate. It's the average growth of cities without Jewish communities. That's the dashed line with a confidence interval. And then it's also the average growth of cities with a Jewish community. That's the solid line. And you can see that after 1600 or so, these lines start to deviate. Beforehand, there's not too much of a difference. So this is consistent with once you have certain places abandoning identity rules as much. I'm not arguing there's no anti-Semitism. I'm not arguing that there's no discrimination, but there's much greater freedom being allowed in certain places once you move away from the religious legitimation and the identity rules that were in place. We have a paper where we look at this and we can show that a lot of these gains in city growth are coming from basically the cities that had a Jewish community benefited more from market access, that is a larger market potential, than cities that didn't. And so that's part of what the story is. So the story is that tolerance, or religious freedom, I prefer to call it, actually did come with economic benefits at this time. Okay, this will be the last slide because I think I've used the time that's allotted to me. And this just summarized what I was talking about. So I won't spend too much time, although I do want to mention is that part of the interesting thing I think about this story is, like, on one hand, this is talking about why did the persecution of religious minorities, like what heretics or Jewish communities, why was it so prevalent at one point in European history, but then it started to tail off? And so by the time you get to the 18th century, there's much, much less of this sort of persecution than there is in, say, the 15th century. I acknowledge it's going to take well into the 19th century to get what we truly consider to be some kind of religious freedom. But this is when Mark and I think the process was being developed. On another level, this is a story about how some states in Europe decided to adopt general rules to govern a population. That is, rules that apply to individuals rather than rules that apply to groups. And this, I think, is a founding principle of liberalism in the way that we think about it today. We treat people as individuals, not as part of some group that they are tied to and they can't exit. We still struggle with issues about where the boundary should be on group rules versus individual rules. Like, should certain organizations be allowed, right, to set their own rules, or should the state force them to treat everybody in their organization the same? This comes up even today. Maybe there'll be some questions about it in the Q&A, but I think that's also relevant. And one of the major things that we find that plays a role in the move towards these general rules is that relatively high capacity states were more likely to do it. They weren't guaranteed to do it, and the history of the 20th century is riddled with examples of strong states that did bad things, right, to religious minorities. But we do think that in the European case, and I could make an argument that for many other places in the world as well, having a strong state was a precondition to eventually moving to the place where you start to abandon the identity rules. Okay, so I will stop there.
All right. Thanks, Noel.
Sure, I'm going to stop sharing, right? There we go.
Yeah. All right. So this is just a reminder. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and ask them, and I will do my best to work my way through the questions that you might have for Noel. The first question I'm going to ask is actually comes from the Q&A because it was close to the first question I was going to ask, and so I'll just say what this person said. So you seem to be suggesting that state capacity is the main driving force, but how does this interact with ideological toleration? So and then he says something like Locke, right? So one explanation can be sort of that religious freedom emerges out of economic changes, right? And we can throw in state capacity or kind of political changes that happen that sort of is about like raw resources and raw power or something like that. And then we can have people like John Locke running around who have ideas about the way that things should work, right? And those ideas are what change things. So what about Locke?
So if you'll indulge me, I have there's a story where Doug North was asked a question. Douglas North was one of my advisors in grad school, and he's eventually won a Nobel Prize well before I met him in economics. But he's an economic historian. He tells a story where he was at a seminar, and it was a very hostile audience, like in France. And I think it was Emmanuel Ladorie who asked him a question about something, and it was like very angry at Doug. But Doug had just that morning like calculated something that answered the question, had in his pocket. So then Ladorie asked the question, and Doug said, he knew at that point they had something good. He pulled it out of his pocket, and then like one. But if you'll indulge me, I have 4 slides that answer this question that I just didn't think I had time to get to, right? So I will do those right now. And maybe they won't answer the question to your satisfaction, but then we can talk about it a little bit. So I was going to talk about this if I happen to get, with like 5 minutes extra time or whatever. So religious freedom, so first of all, I've been using the word toleration and religious freedom somewhat interchangeably. Of course, they're not the same. Toleration comes this Latin root tolere, which is to bear. So like, so the meaning of it, historically was that if I tolerate you, I'm putting up with you, right? Like in some sense. Whereas when I talk about what I'm really talking about here, what we're trying to explain in the book is religious freedom, right? That is, the ability for me to think that you should be able to do what you want to do, right? In some sense. So, but this idea of religious freedom, so here the idea, is, well, actually, the reality of religious freedom is a recent innovation, but the idea is not, right? You know, the idea has been out there for a very long time. So for example, this guy Quintus Aurelius Symmachus, who lived in the 4th century, he's a Roman senator. You know, this is a big time in Rome, the 4th century, right? Because you have Christianity kind of coming in and replacing, challenging the polytheistic like religion that they had at the time. But then, you know, people who believe in polytheism are wondering, why is this monotheistic thing, you know, coming in, right? You know, and forcing us to do like what they want to do. It's actually quite intolerant, you know, they would say, right? You know, so he wanted there to be more of a sense for people can do what they want. But then you ask the question, well, why did Locke and Bale, you know, they could become these heroes of religious freedom, and their, you know, their ideas are justly, you know, revered. But you had people like Paulus Vladimiri, right? You know, in you know, the early 15th century, he delivers a treatise at the Council of Constance, arguing that Christian and pagan nations could coexist in peace. So the idea is there, right? You know, that we could have, you know, this sort of arrangement. Sebastian Castellio may be more familiar. He also, you know, was one of the earlier advocates, you know, but he is not really, it was too early, right? You know, in many ways. He tried to defend Servetus from being, you know, persecuted by the Calvinist state. And also, well, Servetus was persecuted by everybody, right? You know, like, you know, being kicked out of France, and then he fled to Geneva, and then Calvin had him killed, right? You know, like, you know, because he spotted him, you know, in one of the services that he was giving, right? You know, so Castellio was writing and saying, this is wrong, right? You know, we should have, you know, more tolerance for these people. And then this is it. Like, I mean, the argument that Mark and I would give is that the ideas are important, but the ideas will often die out when the institutional equilibrium is not consistent with them surviving. And so but they are super important, right? You know, because not only do they contribute to legitimacy, right? You know, but they can sway individual rulers. And there's a lot of contingency in the story that we're telling, right? Why did some states double down on persecution and either succeed or fail at that, and others were relatively quick, you know, to relax that? And one of the reasons that many states were quick to move away from trying to eliminate religious deviancy is because there developed a large number of adherents, right, you know, to the other religion. And so it became too costly. And ideas certainly play a role in that. But we would argue that you also need to have the institutions in place. And for us, the state capacity argument plays a large role in that. Like, so for example, you can have a relatively weak state, right, that has that will never like be confronted, right, you know, like with religious deviancy, and so we'll never be forced to try to make the decision that we're going to adopt laws, you know, which allow this to persist. And in that situation, you can have individual communities where there's not much toleration at all, right, you know, and they can persist in those areas. So I'll be quiet. That was good. Yeah.
No, that's great. So another question from the queue here. So it says your argument. You know, I think they're okay. They're going along with your argument about increasing state capacity, leading to you know, increasing toleration and then possibly religious freedom as we get later in history. But does your theory work the other direction? So if you see decreases in state capacity, which, you know, you can see sort of in the period as we sort of move in general sort of toward more economic growth, but, you know, in places in the world we can find decreases in state capacity. And do you have any examples in the back of your pocket to sort of tell us that, like, you know, we can see these decreases in the more recent past and that can lead to a breakdown of religious freedom?
That's a good question. I'm just to say, my opinion of the state capacity of the United States of America is much lower this March than it was last March, right? You know, like, so maybe this is like partly like related. It's my opinion of the state capacity of Korea, for example, is much higher, right? You know, like, you know, but the question of, like, if you have a decrease in state capacity, can then that lead to a falling back? Yes, absolutely. I think, right? You know, I think where you see an example of states that, you know, move to cede power to groups, like, you know, like identity groups, right? You can see a resurgence of intolerance, right? You know, that emerges. And I so if you want a solid example of it, right? I'm going to mess that up, right? But I would say, I mean, I don't want to like die on the hill, but like the Soviet Union to Russia, right? Would be one thing that I would suspect might fit that argument, might not, but that's one that comes off the top of my head. I think that's the one I'll go with right now. I could probably think of others that would be even better.
Well, and then so
yeah.
this person sort of along those lines, maybe it doesn't just have to be religious freedom. There can be other liberal, small L liberal values, right? That sort of belong in that cluster with religious freedom that can be affected by this. And so, maybe if you have
freedom of the press, yeah.
To think that you could come up with some other ones. So yeah. I wanted to ask a question about pandemics, just because that features in your book and it features in our lives. And so I wonder if you could just say something about sort of the role that pandemics, the Black Death plays in some of the research that went into the book, and then if you wanted to extrapolate to 2021, no one would fault you for that.
Okay, I'll do my best. Yeah. So so in the book, it actually plays less of a role, right? Than one would think. There's a little bit of stuff on the Black Death in there that's about its relationship to in the Holy Roman Empire, right? Where you have bishops and so forth, and you have persecution of Jews, right? Both massive, right, due to the Black Death. So, for those of you who don't remember, the Black Death occurred in Europe between 1347 and 1352. That was the main event. That's when 40% of the European population or so died in that time. With a lot of variation across locations. Like some cities were more or less wiped out. Maybe they'd have 90% mortality, and then the last people would leave, right? And other places, were left unscathed. You also had recurrences of the Black Death afterwards, but I'm just going to focus for this moment on the big one in the 14th century. And then one thing that's related to our book that happened through this was that people did not understand epidemiology of Black Death at that time. It's a bacterial infection, right? It's very bad, right? And so they would often scapegoat Jewish communities. So there's a number of things going on there. In the book, we make an argument that in the Holy Roman Empire, modern day Germany, the places where you had stronger state control were less likely to allow persecutions of Jews, right? So that's tied into the state capacity argument. More generally, we've looked at on this persecution angle after we wrote the book, right? We did a paper. This one was with Remy Yedwab and Mark Koyama to look at. We were just wondering, well, is there some relationship between the mortality rates from the Black Death and the persecution of Jewish communities at the city level? And when we did this, we were expecting that scapegoating would just be worse the higher the mortality rate and the higher persecution probability. And that was wrong. The strongest relationship is actually that as the mortality rate went up went up in a city, then the Jewish community was less likely to be persecuted. And so we took that as a puzzle and we dug a little bit deeper and we started to think about, well, what made Jewish communities and the non-Jewish community valuable to each other? That is, were there economic complementarities that could exist in some places between those communities and not in others? And one of those would be, were the Jews lending money, or are they mentioned as lending money in the sources? We probably missed some, right? But you can look at where they explicitly are mentioned. And when we did that, we found that protective effect, that the higher the mortality rate, the less likely the Jews would be to be punished or to be killed, right? Was even stronger. And our interpretation is that this is, they're valuable, right? And to rebuild the community, you need them, right? And so that you're even less likely to persecute them when that happens. By contrast, if you look at just cities where the Jews were not lending, then there's zero protective effect. That is, the mortality rate is unrelated to whether you persecute, which means it's just the baseline, and the baseline was massive. It was like 50%, right, of the communities or so were persecuted.
That's really support for like this idea that like it's not just kind of like sort of narrow-minded persecution on, persecution off. It sort of is entangled with a bunch of stuff that's going on in the economy or in politics. Right? It's not sort of like animus like of a single individual on other individuals. It's sort of part of all of the kind of culture and society, right? That's why you can sort of detect these relationships, probably.
Yeah, absolutely. And so two things. Well, first of all, just sticking to one way that I've been trying to think about this more in our present day circumstances. We know that minority groups are often blamed for epidemic disease, even today when we presumably, we have the science, right? And people can educate themselves about why the disease is taking place. But we see this today with politicians calling, for example, coronavirus the Wuhan virus. We've seen an uptick in violence against Asians, like in certain places. And part of the message that I take from our research on the Jewish communities and the Black Death is that fostering contact, either through economic markets or through other means, can be a way to mitigate this sort of violence against minorities. And this is, again, one reason why getting rid of identity rules to a large extent is good, right? Because you have individuals interacting, not these identity groups running into each other. Onto your point, where you talked about it's not just animus, it's tied up into these other sorts of relations that are out there, and often politics. Yes, absolutely. I had more to say about that, but now I've lost it in the back of my head. Right? Yeah.
So I have a couple more questions, some from the Q&A. So one, I think maybe some people in the audience will be interested to sort of hear your thoughts on sort of transporting your theory across the Atlantic to the United States, or to the beginning of the United States, and sort of how sort of how this theory or this framework that you have for kind of thinking about the role of identity rules, how that sort of helps to explain, like, maybe the set of ideas that people were interested in sort of embedding in institutions, or, like just the idea of religious freedom at sort of as it comes into the American lexicon.
Okay, so there's been good research like on this, I believe a lot of the stories, but one of the main, I think the U.S. colonies up to the development of the Constitution, the early history of the United States, I think it does fit our story fairly well. If you look at the origins of the First Amendment, right, which is guaranteeing religious rights in the United States, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the First Amendment was designed to protect religion from the government and not the other way around, right? So you basically had quite a bit of heterogeneity of religious beliefs across U.S. colonies. So you had, Quakers, you had Protestants of various kinds that were all over, and they really believed they were different, right? They didn't like the churches, the other churches. You also had deists, and you also had some reform movements that were out there, revivalism and things like this. And what the consensus emerged was that they didn't want a national religion. And that's because there was so much heterogeneity. The national religion would have been a one size fits all, and it would have upset too many people. So as basically they want the bounds of tolerance to be widened, not because the individuals in the states were tolerant people, but because they didn't want to lose their right, to worship as they pleased, which I think is consistent, with the arguments that we make in the book. So yeah.
And so is there an argument that sort of at the American founding, they sort of have this opportunity to do something sort of anew that is not there in Europe, right? Like they don't get to sort of like there's always going to be more path dependence in Europe, right? In thinking about reforming institutions, right? Because they have to deal with the fact that there was a bunch of people around yesterday who are more strongly connected to those institutions, whereas in the U.S., it's not a clean break. The people are the same for those years. I mean, many of the people are around for that whole duration, but like they get to write some new rules, right? They even get to try once and then try again.
Yeah. No, and I think the nature of the U.S. experiment, is kind of one of uncertain margins, like radical decentralization, right? And so this is federalism, right? And this is one of the aspects where I think this does make the United States exceptional relative to the systems that emerged across much of Europe. Which, by the way, if we relate this back to pandemics, right? This tendency. So there's a really good book. That's not my book, right? But which is also good. But another really good book is by Werner Trosken, Troesken, right? And it's called The Pox of Liberty, and it's really hard to find, but it's small and it's a good read. But Werner, in that book, he argues that the Commerce Clause, like of the U.S. Constitution, which if you go to the CDC's webpage today, they'll explain that they don't actually control things like mask rules, right? Or vaccination policy or anything like that. That's down to the individual states through the Commerce Clause, right? And that's been there for a long time, right? Obviously, right? And so Werner argues in this book, Pox of Liberty, that in the 19th century, when you had the major diseases like cholera and smallpox, right? Moving around. Cholera is basically a waterborne disease that you can mitigate by having good infrastructure, right? Like clean water systems and things like this. Smallpox, on the other hand, is one that there was a vaccine for a long time, right? It was definitely in place by the 19th century. Edward Jenner had developed in the 18th century, right? And so, but then in the United States, he argues that the radical decentralization, well, we'll call it radical, the decentralization of our institutions made smallpox control very hard, right? Because there was no central authority saying everybody needs to get the vaccine. And so there was dissent, by different communities, and they were allowed to do this according to the Commerce Clause, right? To have their own dissent. And so that meant there were these pockets of smallpox that kept on coming up, right? And it was very, very hard to eradicate by the end of the day. And in fact, the United States did much worse than a lot of other places that had less decentralized control. And I think that's really interesting. I think it explains a lot, right, about what the benefits and what the costs are of the system that we've adopted in the United States. Like, for example, cholera, basically property rights were secure enough that our system worked very well. That individual municipalities could get loans, right? And people could be pretty sure they'd pay back the loan, and they built water systems. And so cholera was relatively quick to control, but not infectious diseases, right? Which we're running into again today. And my prediction is we will be running into small pockets of people who resist being vaccinated for years to come, with COVID. Yeah.
So, so kind of moving now to the present, I think, to kind of thinking about. So there's a question here about sort of I think a reemergence of I think what the common parlance would be identity politics, and then how that relates to your idea of identity rules. I'm sort of paraphrasing the question here, and then how identity politics, like the way we would use that term today, relates to identity rules, the way you use that term, and then how that might be problematic for sort of creating or create some problems for creating sort of social cohesion, or create problems of social fragmentation.
Yeah. So I considered having a slide on that, but I think they're related. There's a constant tension, and there's going to be about how much we would like to cede authority to groups, that have their own identity to impose their own rules even on themselves, right? And then of course there's also how much do we want this to be embedded in our law, which is almost the same thing, right? If you're already ceding that authority. And I think it's not always wrong, right? To allow people, to allow the identity rules to be salient. But there does come a time when it does more harm than good. And I think on a lot of margins, we do see that in Western societies today, emerging more and more, where it impacts free speech. Where the arguments that some people should have rules applied to them differently, and we should be treating people as individuals, is, I think, harming discourse on various margins. I think intelligent people can argue about whether this is a more serious problem for the universities than it is on the streets, right? Where there's a lot of prejudice in the first place, right? And then having some rules that are designed to alter those, right, prejudices might be more beneficial. So I think probably there's, the amount of these sorts of rules is the amount you want is different in those two different forums. But I don't know if we get to make that choice. I don't know if that made sense, but but that's it.
I mean, one of the things that you can sort of interpret in sort of out of your book, maybe it's not something that sort of comes up explicitly, but I think that it's a cause of the sort of economic growth, but it also benefits from the existence of economic growth. That, right, sort of bargaining problems or solving problems within society is easier to do when there are gains from trade, right? Mm-hmm. And not just in narrow economic terms, but sort of in broad political terms, right? And so in a world in which we sort of have economic growth, we can possibly that is part of a recipe for sort of addressing sort of the way in which identity rules flow into identity politics, the way and then that flows into social fragmentation, possibly.
Yeah.
So I want to ask.
Go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
So I was going to ask one more question, and then we'll let you go because it's it's late on the East Coast where you are.
Almost 9:15. Yeah.
late for me. Late for me if I was on the East Coast. So kind of again like a modern question, but sort of transporting us back to Europe. I think that I think Macron in France sort of made newspaper headlines in the US for a little bit, sort of with statements about religion in the context of France, and sort of in ways that kind of mirror aspects of American society, but France has a sort of I think a different approach to some of these problems, and so I guess the question is how do you see sort of if it applies on this side of the Atlantic, then if we go back and we're still in this time period, how do you think we can sort of use your book to sort of think through some of the issues on the European continent, or including farther reaches of that?
Okay, so are you thinking about Macron recently? I think he came out arguing that there was a infestation of US ideas in French intellectual thought, right? And that was killing free discourse, right?
And then earlier, I think he made strong statements sort of with respect to Islam and the role that Islam plays in French society.
Right. Yeah. And I think the French, the strict view is that there doesn't exist differences, right? That's what they would like, right? To be purely not that, which I think is tied up in their history, about how they've chosen to approach these issues. I don't know if I have strong policy prescriptions, right? For the sorts of issues that are being confronted. I do think, because it comes down to a hard problem, right? So if you have groups, right, that want, I mean, this is the core tension. Like if you have groups that want to govern themselves differently, like say certain sects of Islam, like certain, like, you know, churches or uh, certain groups of them, then do you deny them that right? Right? You know, it's like, so I have Catholic friends, right, you know, who will argue that my book is wrong, you know, because, you know, Catholics might want things to be a certain way, but you're imposing a radical version of toleration, right? You know, that, you know, why should their children be allowed to do, you know, whatever they want because the state allows them to do it? So I think is a tension there where different, you know, intelligent people can fall down on different sides. But I think the trade-offs are made somewhat clear by our book, namely that there have been benefits to moving away from those identity rules, those treating people as group rules, and that we've really benefited a great deal from the individualism, right? You know, that's come, you know, from that and the way that the laws work. But again, recognizes this tension. I think on the margin, in many areas, we could be moving, you know, towards, you know, holding steady with keeping the laws, you know, from formally acknowledging a lot of these distinctions that individual organizations want to create for themselves.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we will end it there. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for asking questions. So there will be more Benson Center events in the future. So thanks again, and thank you, Noel, and see you next time.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to me on a Thursday night. Yep.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.